Psychological Types by Carl Gustav Jung. The Extroverted Type. In our description of this and the following types, it is necessary, for the sake of clarity, to distinguish between the psychology of consciousness and the psychology of the unconscious. We shall first describe the phenomena of consciousness. 1. The general attitude of consciousness. Although it is true that everyone orients himself in accordance with the data supplied by the outside world, we see every day that the data in themselves are only relatively decisive. The fact that it is cold outside prompts one man to put on his overcoat, while another, who wants to get hardened, finds this superfluous. One man admires the latest tenor because everybody else does. Another refuses to do so, not because he dislikes him, but because in his view the subject of universal admiration is far from having been proved admirable. One man resigns himself to circumstances because experience has shown him that nothing else is possible. Another is convinced that though things have gone the same way 1,000 times before, the 1,000th and first time will be different. The one allows himself to be oriented by the given facts. The other holds in reserve a view which interposes itself between him and the objective data. Now, when orientation by the object predominates in such a way that decisions and actions are determined not by subjective views, but by objective conditions, we speak of an extroverted attitude. When this is habitual, we speak of an extroverted type. If a man thinks, feels, acts, and actually lives in a way that is directly correlated with the objective conditions and their demands, he is extroverted. His life makes it perfectly clear that it is the object and not his subjective view that plays the determining role in his consciousness. Naturally, he has the subjective views too, but their determining value is less than that of the objective conditions. Consequently, he never expects to find any absolute factors in his own inner life, since the only ones he knows are outside himself. Like Epimetheus, his inner life is subordinated to external necessity, though not without a struggle. But it is always the objective determinant that wins in the end. His whole consciousness looks outward, because the essential and decisive determinant always comes from outside. But it comes from outside only because that is where he expects it to come from. All the peculiarities of his psychology, except those that depend on the primacy of one particular psychological function, or on idiosyncrasies of character, follow from this basic attitude. His interest and attention are directed to objective happenings, particularly those in his immediate environment. Not only people but things seize and rivet his attention. Accordingly, they also determine his actions, which are fully explicable on those grounds. The actions of the extrovert are recognizably related to external conditions. Insofar as they are not merely reactive to environmental stimuli, they have a character that is always adapted to the actual circumstances, and they find sufficient play within the limits of the objective situation. No serious effort is made to transcend these bounds. It is the same with his interest. Objective happenings have an almost inexhaustible fascination for him, so that ordinarily he never looks for anything else. The moral laws governing his actions coincide with the demands of society, that is, with the prevailing moral standpoint. If this were to change, the extrovert's subjective moral guidelines would change accordingly, without this altering his general psychological habits in any way. This strict determination by objective factors does not mean, as one might suppose, a complete let alone ideal adaptation to the general conditions of life. In the eyes of the extrovert, of course, an adjustment of this kind to the objective situation must seem like complete adaptation, since for him no other criterion exists. But from a higher point of view, it by no means follows that the objective situation is in all circumstances a normal one. It can quite well be temporarily or locally abnormal. An individual who adjusts himself to it is admittedly conforming to the style of his environment, but together with his whole surroundings, he is in an abnormal situation with respect to the universally valid laws of life. He may indeed thrive in such surroundings, but only up to the point where he and his milieu meet with disaster for transgressing these laws. He will share the general collapse to exactly the same extent as he was adjusted to the previous situation. Adjustment is not adaptation. Adaptation requires far more than merely going along smoothly with the conditions of the moment. Once again, I would remind the reader of Spittler's Epimetheus. It requires observance of laws more universal than the immediate conditions of time and place. The very adjustment of the normal extroverted type is his limitation. He owes his normality on the one hand to his ability to fit into existing conditions with comparative ease. His requirements are limited to the objectively possible, for instance to the career that holds out good prospects at this particular moment. He does what is needed of him, or what is expected of him, and refrains from all innovations that are not entirely self-evident or that in any way exceed the expectations of those around him. On the other hand, his normality must also depend essentially on whether he takes account of his subjective needs and requirements, and this is just his weak point, for the tendency of his type is so outer-directed that even the most obvious of all subjective facts, the condition of his own body, receives scant attention. The body is not sufficiently objective or outside, so that the satisfaction of elementary needs, which are indispensable to physical well-being, is no longer given its due. The body accordingly suffers, to say nothing of the psyche. The extrovert is usually unaware of this latter fact, but it is all the more apparent to his household. He feels his loss of equilibrium only when it announces itself in abnormal body sensations. These he cannot ignore. It is quite natural that he should regard them as concrete and objective, since with his type of mentality they cannot be anything else for him. In others he at once sees imagination at work. A too extroverted attitude can also become so oblivious of the subject that the latter is sacrificed completely to so-called objective demands, to the demands, for instance, of a continually expanding business, because orders are piling up and profitable opportunities have to be exploited. This is the extrovert's danger. He gets sucked into objects and completely loses himself in them. The resultant functional disorders, nervous or physical, have a compensatory value, as they force him into an involuntary self-restraint. Should the symptoms be functional, their peculiar character may express his psychological situation in symbolic form. For instance, a singer whose fame has risen to dangerous heights that tempt him to expend too much energy suddenly finds he cannot sing high notes because of some nervous inhibition. Or a man of modest beginnings who rapidly reaches a social position of great influence, with wide prospects, is suddenly afflicted with all the symptoms of a mountain sickness. Again, a man about to marry a woman of doubtful character whom he adores and vastly overestimates is seized with a nervous spasm of the esophagus and has to restrict himself to 2 cups of milk a day, each of which takes him 3 hours to consume. All visits to the adored are effectively stopped, and he has no choice but to devote himself to the nourishment of his body. Or, a man who can no longer carry the weight of the huge business he has built up is afflicted with nervous attacks of thirst and speedily falls a victim to hysterical alcoholism. Hysteria is, in my view, by far the most frequent neurosis of the extroverted type. The hallmark of classic hysteria is an exaggerated rapport with persons in the immediate environment and an adjustment to surrounding conditions that amounts to imitation. A constant tendency to make himself interesting and to produce an impression is a basic feature of the hysteric. The corollary of this is his proverbial suggestibility, his proneness to another person's influence. Another unmistakable sign of the extroverted hysteric is his effusiveness, which occasionally carries him into the realm of fantasy, so that he is accused of the hysterical lie. The hysterical character begins as an exaggeration of the normal attitude. It is then complicated by compensatory reactions from the unconscious, which counteract the exaggerated extroversion by means of physical symptoms that force the libido to introvert. The reaction of the unconscious produces another class of symptoms, having a more introverted character, one of the most typical being a morbid intensification of fantasy activity. After this general outline of the extroverted attitude, we shall now turn to a description of the modifications which the basic psychological functions undergo as a result of this attitude. 2. The attitude of the unconscious. It may perhaps seem odd that I should speak of an attitude of the unconscious. As I have repeatedly indicated, I regard the attitude of the unconscious as compensatory to consciousness. According to this view, the unconscious has as good a claim to an attitude as the latter. In the preceding section, I emphasized the tendency to one-sidedness in the extroverted attitude, due to the ascendancy of the object over the course of psychic events. The extroverted type is constantly tempted to expend himself for the apparent benefit of the object, to assimilate subject to object. I have discussed in some detail the harmful consequences of an exaggeration of the extroverted attitude, namely, the suppression of the subjective factor. It is only to be expected, therefore, that the psychic compensation of the conscious extroverted attitude will lay special weight on the subjective factor, and that we shall find a markedly egocentric tendency in the unconscious. Practical experience proves this to be the case. I do not wish to cite case material at this point, so I must refer my readers to the ensuing sections, where I try to present the characteristic attitude of the unconscious in each function type. In this section, we are concerned simply with the compensation of the extroverted attitude in general, so I shall confine myself to describing the attitude of the unconscious in equally general terms. The attitude of the unconscious as an effective complement to the conscious extroverted attitude has a definitely introverting character. It concentrates the libido on the subjective factor, that is, on all those needs and demands that are stifled or repressed by the conscious attitude. As may be gathered from what was said in the previous section, a purely objective orientation does violence to a multitude of subjective impulses, intentions, needs, and desires, and deprives them of the libido that is their natural right. Man is not a machine that can be remodeled for quite other purposes as occasion demands, in the hope that it will go on functioning as regularly as before, but in quite a different way. He carries his whole history with him, and his very structure is written in the history of mankind. This historical element in man represents a vital need to which a wise psychic economy must respond. Somehow the past must come alive and participate in the present. Total assimilation to the object will always arouse the protest of the suppressed minority of those elements that belong to the past and have existed from the very beginning. From these general considerations, it is easy to see why the unconscious demands of the extrovert have an essentially primitive, infantile, egocentric character. When Freud says that the unconscious can do nothing but wish, this is very largely true of the unconscious of the extrovert. His adjustment to the objective situation and his assimilation to the object prevent low-powered subjective impulses from reaching consciousness. These impulses, thoughts, wishes, affects, needs, feelings, etc., take on a regressive character according to the degree of repression. The less they are acknowledged, the more infantile and archaic they become. The conscious attitude robs them of all energy that is readily disposable, only leaving them the energy of which it cannot deprive them. This residue, which still possesses a potency not to be underestimated, can be described only as primordial instinct. Instinct can never be eradicated in an individual by arbitrary measures. It requires the slow, organic transformation of many generations to effect a radical change, for instinct is the energic expression of the organism's makeup. Thus, with every repressed impulse, a considerable amount of energy ultimately remains, of an instinctive character, and preserves its potency despite the deprivation that made it unconscious. The more complete the conscious attitude of extroversion is, the more infantile and archaic the unconscious attitude will be. The egoism which characterizes the extrovert's unconscious attitude goes far beyond mere childish selfishness. It verges on the ruthless and the brutal. Here we find in full flower the incest wish described by Freud. It goes without saying that these things are entirely unconscious and remain hidden from the layman so long as the extroversion of the conscious attitude is not extreme. But whenever it is exaggerated, the unconscious comes to light in symptomatic form. Its egoism, infantilism, and archaism lose their original compensatory character and appear in more or less open opposition to the conscious attitude. This begins as an absurd exaggeration of the conscious standpoint, aiming at a further repression of the unconscious, but usually it ends in a reductio ad absurdum of the conscious attitude, and hence in catastrophe. The catastrophe may take an objective form, since the objective aims gradually become falsified by the subjective. I remember the case of a printer who, starting as a mere employee, worked his way up after years of hard struggle till at last he became the owner of a flourishing business. The more it expanded, the more it tightened its hold on him, until finally it swallowed up all his other interests. This proved his ruin. As an unconscious compensation of his exclusive interest in the business, certain memories of his childhood came to life. As a child, he had taken great delight in painting and drawing, but instead of renewing this capacity for its own sake as a compensating hobby, he channeled it into his business and began wondering how he might embellish his products in an artistic way. Unfortunately, his fantasies materialized. He actually turned out stuff that suited his own primitive and infantile taste, with the result that after very few years his business went to pieces. He acted in accordance with one of our cultural ideas, which says that any enterprising person has to concentrate everything on the one aim in view. But he went too far, and merely fell a victim to the power of his infantile demands. The catastrophe can, however, also be subjective and take the form of a nervous breakdown. This invariably happens when the influence of the unconscious finally paralyzes all conscious action. The demands of the unconscious then force themselves imperiously on consciousness and bring about a disastrous split which shows itself in one of two ways. Either the subject no longer knows what he really wants and nothing interests him, or he wants too much at once and has too many interests, but in impossible things. The suppression of infantile and primitive demands for cultural reason easily leads to a neurosis or to the abuse of narcotics such as alcohol, morphine, cocaine, etc. In more extreme cases, the split ends in suicide. It is an outstanding peculiarity of unconscious impulses that, when deprived of energy by lack of conscious recognition, they take on a destructive character, and this happens as soon as they cease to be compensatory. Their compensatory function ceases as soon as they reach a depth corresponding to a cultural level absolutely incompatible with our own. From this moment, the unconscious impulses form a block in every way opposed to the conscious attitude, and its very existence leads to open conflict. Generally speaking, the compensating attitude of the unconscious finds expression in the maintenance of the psychic equilibrium. A normal extroverted attitude does not, of course, mean that the individual invariably behaves in accordance with the extroverted schema. Even in the same individual, many psychological processes may be observed that involve the mechanism of introversion. We call a mode of behavior extroverted only when the mechanism of extroversion predominates. In these cases, the most differentiated function is always employed in an extroverted way, whereas the inferior functions are introverted. In other words, the superior function is the most conscious one and completely under conscious control, whereas the less differentiated functions are in part unconscious and far less under the control of consciousness. The superior function is always an expression of the conscious personality, of its aims, will, and general performance, whereas the less differentiated functions fall into the category of things that simply happen to one. These things need not be mere slips of the tongue or pen and other such oversights. They can equally well be half or three-quarters intended, for the less differentiated functions also possess a slight degree of consciousness. A classic example of this is the extroverted feeling type, who enjoys an excellent feeling rapport with the people around him, yet occasionally happens to express opinions of unsurpassable tactlessness. These opinions spring from his inferior and half-conscious thinking, which, being only partly under his control and insufficiently related to the object, can be quite ruthless in its effects. The less differentiated functions of the extrovert always show a highly subjective coloring with pronounced egocentricity and personal bias, thus revealing their close connection with the unconscious. The unconscious is continually coming to light through them. It should not be imagined that the unconscious lies permanently buried under so many overlying strata that it can only be uncovered, so to speak, by a laborious process of excavation. On the contrary, there is a constant influx of unconscious contents into the conscious psychological process, to such a degree that at times it is hard for the observer to decide which character traits belong to the conscious and which to the unconscious personality. This difficulty is met with mainly in people who are given to express themselves more profusely than others. Naturally, it also depends very largely on the attitude of the observer, whether he seizes hold of the conscious or the unconscious character of the personality. Generally speaking, a judging observer will tend to seize on the conscious character, while the perceptive observer will be more influenced by the unconscious character, since judgment is chiefly concerned with the conscious motivation of the psychic process, while perception registers the process itself. But insofar as we apply judgment and perception in equal measure, it may easily happen that a personality appears to us both introverted and extroverted, so that we cannot decide at first to which attitude the superior function belongs. In such cases, only a thorough analysis of the qualities of each function can help us to form a valid judgment. We must observe which function is completely under conscious control, and which functions have a haphazard and spontaneous character. The former is always more highly differentiated than the latter, which also possesses infantile and primitive traits. Occasionally, the superior function gives the impression of normality, while the others have something abnormal or pathological about them. 3. The peculiarities of the basic psychological functions in the extroverted attitude. Thinking. As a consequence of the general attitude of extroversion, thinking is oriented by the object and objective data. This gives rise to a noticeable peculiarity. Thinking in general is fed on the one hand from subjective and in the last resort unconscious sources, and on the other hand from objective data transmitted by sense perception. Extroverted thinking is conditioned in a larger measure by the latter than by the former. Judgment always presupposes a criterion. For the extroverted judgment, the criterion supplied by external conditions is the valid and determining one, no matter whether it be represented directly by an objective, perceptible fact or by an objective idea. For an objective idea is equally determined by external data or borrowed from outside, even when it is subjectively sanctioned. Extroverted thinking, therefore, need not necessarily be purely concretistic thinking. It can just as well be purely ideal thinking, if, for instance, it can be shown that the ideas it operates with are largely borrowed from outside, i.e., have been transmitted by tradition and education. So in judging whether a particular thinking is extroverted or not, we must first ask, by what criterion does it judge? Does it come from outside, or is its origin subjective? A further criterion is the direction the thinking takes in drawing conclusions, whether it is principally directed outwards or not. It is no proof of its extroverted nature that it is preoccupied with concrete objects, since my thinking may be preoccupied with a concrete object either because I am abstracting my thought from it, or because I am concretizing my thought through it. Even when my thinking is preoccupied with concrete things, and could be described as extroverted to that extent, the direction it will take still remains an essential characteristic and an open question, namely, whether or not in its further course it leads back again to objective data, external facts, or generally accepted ideas. So far as the practical thinking of the businessman, the technician, or the scientific investigator is concerned, its outer directedness is obvious enough. But in the case of the philosopher, it remains open to doubt when his thinking is directed to ideas. We then have to inquire whether these ideas are simply abstractions from objective experience, in which case they would represent higher collective concepts comprising the sum of objective facts, or whether, if they are clearly not abstractions from immediate experience, they may not be derived from tradition or borrowed from the intellectual atmosphere of the time. In the latter case, they fall into the category of objective data, and accordingly this thinking should be called extroverted. Although I do not propose to discuss the nature of introverted thinking at this point, reserving it for a later section, it is essential that I should say a few words about it before proceeding further. For if one reflects on what I have just said about extroverted thinking, one might easily conclude that this covers everything that is ordinarily understood as thinking. A thinking that is directed neither to objective facts nor to general ideas, one might argue, scarcely deserves the name thinking at all. I am fully aware that our age and its most eminent representatives know and acknowledge only the extroverted type of thinking. This is largely because all the thinking that appears visibly on the surface in the form of science or philosophy, or even art, either derives directly from objects or else flows into general ideas. For both these reasons it appears essentially understandable, even though it may not always be self-evident, and is therefore regarded as valid. In this sense, it might be said that the extroverted intellect oriented by objective data is actually the only one that is recognized. But, and now I come to the question of the introverted intellect, There also exists an entirely different kind of thinking, to which the term thinking can hardly be denied. It is a kind that is oriented neither by immediate experience of objects nor by traditional ideas. I reach this other kind of thinking in the following manner. When my thoughts are preoccupied with a concrete object or a general idea, in such a way that the course of my thinking eventually leads me back to my starting point, this intellectual process is not the only psychic process that is going on in me. I will disregard all those sensations and feelings which become noticeable as a more or less disturbing accompaniment to my train of thought, and will merely point out that this very thinking process, which starts from the object and returns to the object, also stands in a constant relation to the subject. This relation is a sine qua non, without which no thinking process whatsoever could take place. Even though my thinking process is directed, as far as possible, to objective data, it is still my subjective process, and it can neither avoid nor dispense with this admixture of subjectivity. Struggle as I may to give an objective orientation to my train of thought, I cannot shut out the parallel subjective process and its running accompaniment without extinguishing the very spark of life from my thought. This parallel process has a natural and hardly avoidable tendency to subjectify the objective data and assimilate them to the subject. Now, when the main accent lies on the subjective process, that other kind of thinking arises which is opposed to extroverted thinking, namely, that purely subjective orientation which I call introverted. This thinking is neither determined by objective data nor directed to them. It is a thinking that starts from the subject and is directed to subjective ideas or subjective facts. I do not wish to enter more fully into this kind of thinking here. I have merely established its existence as the necessary complement of extroverted thinking and brought it into clearer focus. Extroverted thinking, then, comes into existence only when the objective orientation predominates. This fact does nothing to alter the logic of thinking. It merely constitutes that difference between thinkers which James considered a matter of temperament. Orientation to the object, as already explained, makes no essential change in the thinking function. Only its appearance is altered. It has the appearance of being captivated by the object, as though without the external orientation it simply could not exist. It almost seems as though it were a mere sequela of external facts, or as though it could reach its highest point only when flowing into some general idea. It seems to be constantly affected by the objective data and to draw conclusions only with their consent. Hence it gives one the impression of a certain lack of freedom, of occasional short-sightedness, in spite of all its adroitness within the area circumscribed by the objects. What I am describing is simply the impression this sort of thinking makes on the observer, who must himself have a different standpoint. Otherwise it would be impossible for him to observe the phenomenon of extroverted thinking at all. But because of his different standpoint, he sees only its outward aspect, not its essence, whereas the thinker himself can apprehend its essence, but not its outward aspect. Judging by appearances can never do justice to the essence of the thing. Hence the verdict is in most cases depreciatory. In its essence, this thinking is no less fruitful and creative than introverted thinking. It merely serves other ends. This difference becomes quite palpable when extroverted thinking appropriates material that is the special province of introverted thinking. When, for instance, a subjective conviction is explained analytically in terms of objective data or is being derived from objective ideas. For our scientific consciousness, however, the difference becomes even more obvious when introverted thinking attempts to bring objective data into connections not warranted by the object. In other words, to subordinate them to a subjective idea. Each type of thinking senses the other as an encroachment on its own province, and hence a sort of shadow effect is produced, each revealing to the other its least favorable aspect. Introverted thinking then appears as something quite arbitrary, while extroverted thinking seems dull and banal. Thus the two orientations are incessantly at war. One might think it easy enough to put an end to this conflict by making a clear distinction between objective and subjective data. Unfortunately, this is impossible, though not a few have attempted it. And even if it were possible, it would be a disastrous proceeding, since in themselves both orientations are one-sided and of limited validity, so that each needs the influence of the other. When objective data predominate over thinking to any great extent, thinking is sterilized, becoming a mere appendage of the object, and no longer capable of abstracting itself into an independent concept. It is then reduced to a kind of afterthought, by which I do not mean reflection, but a purely imitative thinking which affirms nothing beyond what was visibly and immediately present in the objective data in the first place. This thinking naturally leads directly back to the object, but never beyond it, not even to a linking of experience with an objective idea. Conversely, when it has an idea for an object, it is quite unable to experience its practical, individual value, but remains stuck in a more or less tautological position. The materialistic mentality is an instructive example of this. When introverted thinking is subordinated to objective data, as a result of overdetermination by the object, it engrosses itself entirely in the individual experience and accumulates a mass of undigested empirical material. The oppressive weight of individual experiences having little or no connection with one another produces the dissociation of thought, which usually requires psychological compensation. This must consist in some simple, general idea that gives coherence to the disordered whole, or at least affords the possibility of such. Ideas like matter or energy serve this purpose. But when the thinking depends primarily not on objective data, but on some second-hand idea, the very poverty of this thinking is compensated by an all the more impressive accumulation of facts, congregating around a narrow and sterile point of view, with the result that many valuable and meaningful aspects are completely lost sight of. Many of the allegedly scientific outpourings of our own day owe their existence to this wrong orientation.